Oregon has their new running backs coach, and boy, it looks like a great hire. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
By all accounts, coming over from USC last year, Gary Bryant Jr. was a good wideout for the Ducks. 30 catches, 442 yards, 4 touchdowns. I think my favorite Gary Bryant Jr. play so far in his Oregon career was that touchdown against Arizona State where he catches the ball out wide, spins away from two guys who kind of crash into each other, takes off for like a 75-yard touchdown. It helped get Bo Nix the nickname the Yak Merchant, of course, but that was just a heck of a football play. I wonder about Gary Bryant Jr.'s role coming into this season. So a question came in from the subtext community, which you can join, link in the description below wherever you listen to or watch this show, about whether Gary Bryant Jr. will stick around with the Ducks this season. I suspect that he will. I don't expect Bryant to be a guy that hits the transfer portal when it opens on April 15th. And as we, go through that spring portal window and the spring game on April 27th, I'm sure there will be guys that jump into the portal. That's kind of the way of college football nowadays. But I think that for Bryant, he's got an established role, and he just has to hold on to it. I don't think he's chasing anybody else on this receiving core. Evan Stewart's going to be the number one wide receiver, and Tez Johnson will be the number 2 at the slot, and Traeshon Holden's probably your primary guy on the outside, and Gary Bryant Jr. can play anywhere. He can play inside, he can play outside, and I think he's, the next guy in that rotation. That's what he was a season ago. I expect him to be in a similar capacity this year. I think that his receiving role is the most open of Oregon's top wideouts. Now, you can make the case for Traeshon Holden. I'm really high on Holden, and I like Gary Bryant Jr. a lot, but this is just where Oregon's receiving core is at. Like, truly, Traeshon Holden said the other day after practice, he was fielding questions, and, he said what a lot of players say is, we have the best wide receiver room in the country. With Oregon, that might actually be true. Like, you've got Evan Stewart, you have Tez Johnson, who just set the program record with regards to single-season receptions and had a 1,000-yard season, while Troy Franklin was in the room. Like, those are your top 2 guys. Then you have Traeshon Holden, who could be a number 1 on several teams in the Big Ten or Power 4 conferences writ large. I don't think he'd be necessarily the highest end number 1 guy, but he can be a number 1 receiver. He's got that sort of body type and explosiveness, and I think he really showcased that in the moments that he shined bright last year, and when he got an opportunity to catch the ball. When that's your number 3, now you're number 2. If Traeshon Holden, right, if Evan Stewart never came in and Traeshon Holden were your number 1 outside receiver and Tez Johnson were inside, I'd still feel good about Oregon's receiver room. Instead, if you come out in, base 11 personnel, 1 back, 1 tight end, 3 receivers, and your 3 wideouts, snap 1 for the offense with Dylan Gabriel behind center, and you've got Evan Stewart as your receiver on the outside on one end, and then you've got Traeshon Holden on the other, and Tez Johnson in the slot, and Terrence Ferguson as your tight end. That's just a wide array of weapons. But bringing this back to Gary Bryant Jr., because that's where the question was centered, I think he's got the most to lose in spring football amongst these wideouts, just because he's not a guy that is going to be a number 1 target. I don't think he could, have more upward mobility on the depth chart. I think he just kind of is where he's at. Now, if Tez Johnson were to go down with an injury, Gary Bryant would be your number 1 slot receiver. I think that is pretty clear. With the way they use Tez Johnson with some pop passes and screen passes and in the RPO game, I think Bryant fits that really, really well. But he's got Jurrion Dickey and Kyler Casper, who have been on campus for at least 1 year each. Now, Dickey wasn't fully healthy last season after getting injured his senior year of high school, and Kyler Casper was a 2023 recruit, but reclassified to 2022. Still a really talented guy, more of a big-bodied receiver who could play on the outside, but Jurrion Dickey, He wants to play, and I think Oregon fans are well aware of just how talented he is and what he is capable of as a wide receiver. And when your fourth best wideout catches 30 balls for 440 yards and 4 touchdowns, that's when you've got, number one, a really good passing game, because Will Stein is a very good offensive coordinator. But number two, you've just got a real depth of talent. I think that Gary Bryant Jr., having stuck around to this point, is indicative that he wouldn't leave. Like if he were going to seek a larger role elsewhere, I think he would have done that already. Maybe he reconsiders depending on how things shake out during spring practice and what the depth chart looks like and how Jurrion Dickey looks. Because Bryant was a very highly touted recruit coming out of high school as well. He was not on Jurrion Dickey's level, and I think in the long run, Dickey's kind of a better version with a higher ceiling of Gary Bryant. But is he ready to contribute? That's a question, and that's something that's going to get answered over the course of spring practice that Junior Adams and Will Stein and now Rashad Samples will be evaluating for Oregon's receiver room. Because if Dickey starts to hit his full potential, and Stein talked at the beginning of spring practice about how last year he didn't really know the plays or where to go and everything like that. Like, he wasn't a spring enrollee, he was a fall enrollee, because he finished his high school's career on a more normal timeline. He then shows up and isn't fully healthy and isn't grasping the playbook entirely, but Stein said now he is, and sky's the limit for that guy. Well, okay. When the offensive coordinator is saying what we all think, and what appears just to be true with the way that he was recruited coming out of high school, I think he's someone who at the very least will push Gary Bryant Jr. for snaps. Now, I think there's definitely room for both to be on the field, but how many balls will one guy catch if the other is in the mix, right? If they have to kind of split that fourth receiver position, is that something he's open to? I don't know. Or maybe Bryant is just able to lean on his experience and Will Stein's familiarity with him in the offense, and certainly he did a lot of good things at the wide receiver position last year. If he is able to just kind of hold on to that spot, then yeah, I would definitely think that he sticks around, because he is definitely talented enough to be a number 2 receiver on a Power 4 college football team. Absolutely. But he did not seek that option. And so, barring a change in spring football, I think that Bryant is probably the number 4 receiver, and Dickey is probably 5th, and Casper 6th, and those are your top wideouts. And, if you have an injury here or there, you adjust the depth chart accordingly. But I don't expect Gary Bryant to have a bigger role than he had last year. I think that within the structure of the passing offense, you're just going to have guys that will always get more targets. I think Dillon Gabriel is going to throw to Tez Johnson a lot. I mean, a lot. His leading receiver last year was Drake Stoops, who worked out of the slot almost entirely. And yes, Drake Stoops was the son of Oklahoma legendary coach Bob Stoops. And never forget, Bob Stoops against Mike Bellotti, Oklahoma, Oregon. Was it 2006? With the onside kick? What a day. Okay, anyway, I'm sure that was a fun trip down memory lane for, Oregon fans, because Oregon won that game. So, heck of a call. All right. I think that Dillon Gabriel is going to look at Tez Johnson and say, this is familiar to me, because Drake Stoops is someone who he had a great rapport with a year ago, but Tez Johnson is better than Drake Stoops. I think he's better in the open field, and I think he's a better route runner, and I think they've got similar sort of body type and build, and, where they thrive with, their routes and everything like that, and the sorts of routes that he's going to run. I think Johnson could lead Oregon in receiving receptions. I'll say receptions. I think he could lead Oregon in receptions again. Will he lead Oregon in receiving yards? I don't know, because Evan Stewart's explosive and dynamic, but I think this receiving core is good. I think Gary Bryant can have a role, but I think of the top 4 wideouts that Oregon's got, 3 of whom are returning from last year, I think his spot is the most up for grabs compared to the other 3. But still, I'd expect that he is probably the starter there. But we'll see how that plays out over the course of spring football and kind of what happens in the spring game, which will have some really fascinating matchups. What are the most exciting matchups for Oregon in the spring game, which is less than 20 days away? How about that? That's coming up next.